Good morning. Welcome to the session, Expanding the Methodological Toolbox, Medieval and Early Modern Context. I'm Or Posiado from the Jewish Art Department at Bar-Ilan University. Unfortunately, Emil Schreiber could not come to the conference, and I will replace him today as the chair of this session. This session will bring together lectures focusing on one of the main objectives of this conference, which is to examine the methodologies of Jewish art. In this session, we will do so by exploring some cases from medieval and early modern times. Note that the question and answers will be held at the end of the entire session. Entire sessions, yes. And now I'm happy to present our first speaker, Ephraim Shoham-Steiner. Ephraim is a historian specializing in medieval Jewish history at the Department of the Jewish History at the Ben-Gurion University. He is also the board member of the I-Core Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters at Ben-Gurion University. His first Hebrew book was recently translated to English, On the Margins of a Minority. He also published on Jewish-Christian encounters and polemics, Jewish reactions to the cult of Virgin Mary, shrines, and pilgrimage, and the medieval Jewish community of Cologne. The working title of his next book made me very curious, and it is The Medieval Jewish Criminal Underworld. The title of his lecture today, and I see that you changed it to this. Okay, Lions, Snakes, a Rabbi, and a Parnas. And you look at a debate about the artwork in the medieval synagogue in Cologne. So welcome, Ephraim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mo. Thank you all. You know that when the Chazan enters the pulpit, when he begins his services on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim, the high Jewish holidays, he begins by a prayer saying, Hineni ha'ani mimas nir'ash v'nifchad. I'm completely in awe and trembling, standing before a conference of art historians talking about art in medieval Europe, because I'm a textual historian, I'm a social historian. For me, art is inspiring, but it's more of a hobby. I would like to infuse my research with art, and many of the colleagues that I consult and I speak to are sitting in this room, so you can now judge what you've been trying to help me do over the past few months or year. In the late 12th and early 13th century, in the large halachic compendium called Sefer Avi Ezri, compiled by Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel Alevi of Bonn, we find in the section related to idol worship, Avodah Zarah, an earlier source that he had probably encountered in the family archive dossier of halachic writings. It was a letter his great-grandfather, his mother's maternal grandfather, had written almost a century earlier, that he had found instrumental to his discussion. And I quote, "And of the same matter, the issue of Avodah Zarah, I, Avi Ezri, Eliezer's nickname, and the book title, bearing his acronym, Eliezer ben Yoel, Aleph Bet Yud, found a letter of my elder, my mother's maternal grandfather, our Rabbi Eliakim ben Yosef, and it reads, concerning the building that was built in the name, probably of a specific person, in the synagogue at Cologne, on the northern wall, on the windows in which they formed, the Hebrew word is tsaru, images of lions and serpents, and which I was greatly astonished to see that they had done this there. They changed an ancient custom. In some of the manuscripts it reads, the custom of the ancients, which the earlier ones were not accustomed to do in any of the places of their exile. And it is known to our teachers that the custom of the ancient ones has the full status of Torah, and it is like a post firmly planted in the ground on which to depend and to draw support from. Even their intention was for the heavens, to be pleasing to their Creator. The second commandment warned us and them not to do this And it is written, "You shall not make for yourself a graven image." This text I've just quoted is the opening statement of a rather long and elaborate letter that will be the subject of my discussion today. Although the great-grandson Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel Halevi, Ravia, introduced the text as a tshuva, namely a responsum, assuming a query was launched and a responsum given, I think it can be defined more accurately as a letter of protest. It is my impression from reading the text that no one in Cologne's Jewish community, most definitely among the individual or individuals that had commissioned the decorations, actually reached out seeking counsel from Rabbi Eliakim ben Yosef of Mainz, who wrote the letter. In the next few moments, I will attempt to use this letter of protest as a springboard to introduce a discussion about the Jewish community of medieval Cologne, its leadership, and some possible insights into its ideas and beliefs that manifest in themselves in the ornamentations chosen to embellish one of the walls and windows of its synagogue. It is a remarkable example where art history, textual history, modern archaeology, social anthropology, and theology, as well as the defining factors of a collective and cultural self-identity, meet. In my talk today, I will argue and hopefully convince you that the text in question refers to events in the 11th century, and that the decorations protested against by Eliakim ben Yosef that were commissioned by someone or some people in the Jewish community of Cologne were not images in stained glass windows, as was usually argued, but rather three-dimensional stone reliefs that were not only a more common decorative feature at the time period, but also slightly more problematic from the halachic point of view, at least to some, especially at the time period and within this specific urban context. The second point I will try and make, based on both the earlier dating and the recent archaeological finds from Cologne, is that the halachic discussion about the synagogue decorations was possibly part of a larger host of issues. Questions of authority, power, claims of leadership, and the nature of leadership in a community that was, on the one hand, part of a larger Jewish presence in the Rhineland area, but on the other, a community that strove to maintain a unique statement of identity where art and the role of art in the liturgical realm of the synagogue was just one rather important aspect. The synagogue in question is located in the Rathausplatz, in the center of the Altstadt of Cologne, and it was the heart of the medieval Cologne Jewish neighborhood. And you can see here an aerial photo of the area with the tent. I'm going to use this because I'm trying to be an art historian. This is the tent. This is a blow-up. Most of these excavations are now covered up. There are programs to turn this entire area into a museum. There's a huge debate over the content of this museum and how the Jewish past is going to be represented in this museum. But the fact of the matter is that the museum is going to be located smack in the middle of the Altstadt of Cologne, and it's supposed to incorporate all the findings from the archaeological excavation, both Jewish and non-Jewish, both from the Roman period and later periods in the medieval, into one building. And you can imagine that this is quite a host of issues on the table of the people who are supposed to make the decisions. The incident in Cologne, and this is the issue that we're referring to here, Maaseh Colonia, is an episode that I believe occurred in the 11th century in Cologne, in which lion and serpent decorations were placed in the walls of the local synagogue, arousing the ire of the rabbi from Mainz. In Cologne, Jews were more involved in trade, while in Mainz, as in the entire Middle Rhine area, there were also, as Michael Toch has masterfully demonstrated recently, a more rural and agricultural interface where viticulture, vineyards, and the wine industry, an aspect extensively discussed by Chaim Soloveitchik, played a more significant role. Alfred Haverkamp had argued that Cologne, Mainz, as well as other episcopal cities like Trier, Regensburg, Sens, and other towns in Northern Europe were among the cities to reap the benefits of the political and demographic developments, as well as the rise of commerce and local as well as super-regional trade in the 11th century. By the time of the incident we will focus on, and the time it occurred, the Jewish community in medieval Ashkenaz had already a relatively well-established and visible presence in both the Lower Rhine area, the area in and around Cologne, as well as in the Middle Rhine region in and around Mainz, gravitating around the Shum communities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. It should be pointed out that although in our minds, both Mainz and Cologne and their respective Jewish communities had a strong tie to one another and may be seen as part of the term Ashkenaz, they are about 100 miles apart. And during this time, they belonged to two different ecclesiastical and political entities within the Ottonian Reich. The Archbishopric of Cologne and the Archbishopric of Mainz, and they were separate, and they were owned by two different masters, two different lords. Cologne had belonged originally to the realm known as Lothringen, an area that had much stronger ties to both England and northern France than to the more German Middle Rhine and the central eastern realms of Germany. Our knowledge of these communities at this time, the late 11th century, derives mainly, but not solely, from inter-Jewish sources compiled and penned by the male rabbinic elite of society, who left behind an impressive paper trail in the form of biblical, Talmudic exegesis, Jewish court rulings, preserved in halachic responsa, and a rather extensive body of liturgical poetry, piyut. We thus have more knowledge of rabbinic figures from this period who are more active in the Middle Rhine area of the Shum communities gravitating around the Torah centers of study in Mainz and Worms. When it comes to the lay members of society and even lay leadership who are not rabbis, our knowledge is rather limited. We know that both these communities had a kahal, and we know, however, very little about the people in the kahal, the people who were members of the kahal, that were not learned men. Thus, our acquaintance with the early medieval Jewish community of Cologne, that unlike Mainz, didn't have a powerful rabbinic presence in the 11th century in the form of a vibrant Torah study center, not even much later into the 12th century and early 13th, and therefore our knowledge of this community is slightly more insufficient. Let us now look at the main player. As far as we can tell, Rabbi Eliakim was born during the last third of the 11th century, in and around 1070. He lived until the middle of the 12th century and died probably between 1150 and 1152. He became rabbinically active while still young, probably before the 1096 riots, and his career developed throughout the first half of the 12th century after having survived the riots. In light of this dating, as well as... Can this be lower a bit? There's something, there's a playback in the... Okay. So, do you want to turn off the stuff? Okay, I'm gonna stop. Okay. In light of this dating, as well as my discussion that will follow, I will suggest that the letter cited by Ravia in his book, Avia Ezri, quoting his great-grandfather, was written during the last decade of the 11th century, before the First Crusade and anti-Jewish riots. And this notion is supported by the fact that it is reasonable to assume that if the decorations had been commissioned, executed, and opposed after the violence of 1096, when the Cologne community as well as the Rhineland communities were in the process of recovering from the demographic and infrastructural damage caused by the 1096 violent events, and while the synagogue, after having been severely damaged, was in the process of renovation and rebuilding, we would have heard at least an echo of this in the letter itself. There you go. However, no such mention is made. Rabbi Eliakim's letter is not addressed in any particular, or doesn't address any particular recipients. In its opening, Rabbi Eliakim expresses his surprise at lion and serpent decorations placed... Yeah, right. Okay, wait. Is this better? Okay. Rabbi Eliakim's letter is not addressed to any particular recipient. In its opening, Rabbi Eliakim expresses his surprise at the lion and serpent decorations placed on the northern wall of the synagogue in Cologne. It is likely that the decorations were added to the northern wall window frames when the already existing synagogue was renovated and slightly expanded towards the end of the 11th century. As both the excavations in the 1950s by Otto Doppelfeld, as well as the recent work done in the site, suggest, the basic outline of the synagogue was drawn in the early 11th century, sometime in and around 1021. The outlines survived through most of the Middle Ages and up until the expulsion from Cologne in the 1420s. The excavations revealed that the late 11th century synagogue was expanded, and a chapel with a chapel structure that was added on the northern wall. This is it. Okay? This is the existing rectangular site as it apparently looked in the 14th century, but already the baseline of this structure appears in the 11th century. Okay? And what you have here is more or less how this would look in a map. This is the rectangular site of the synagogue, and this is the addition. Eventually, it morphed into what is known as the Frauenschule, but this is the courtyard in which both the synagogue, the mikveh, and the public building of what eventually morphed into the Tanzhaus was present. And you have here the general layout of what we would call the Judenviertel, the Jewish quarter of medieval Cologne, the area owned by Jews. And of course, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the fact that we have a ledger known as the Judenschreinsbuch that dates back all into the 12th century that registers a lot of the Jewish properties in Cologne. So we have a pretty good map of the properties within the medieval Jewish quarter of Cologne. The rapid rise in the Jewish community economic strength and its members' growing involvement in commerce, trade, and economic progression of the 11th century triggered a demographic growth. The archaeological evidence suggests that this addition, the northern addition, was made in the late 11th century before the synagogue suffered substantial damage during the 1096 riots. I suggest that it is in this new expansion that the windows in question were located, and it was in the northern wall that the decorations that raised the ire of the Rabbi of Mainz were carved. Rabbi Eliakim probably turned to the community lay leaders, the Parnasim, in Cologne, requesting they remove the lion and serpent decorations. In his eyes, the decorations constituted a transgression of the second commandment, do not make an idol or image. Although Rabbi Eliakim admitted that the commissioner's aim was well intended, to beautify the synagogue and to make it more pleasing to God, the images were nevertheless unacceptable, both in the terms of a particular choice of animals, the similarity between the serpent, specifically the serpent, and a dragon, a focus of idol worship mentioned specifically in the Talmud as objectionable, and the fact that they were three-dimensional. This last concern is not mentioned explicitly in the text, but it is supported by the strong contextual evidence within the text. Indeed, a close reading of the text that Rabbi Eliakim brings as proof text to support his claim that the decorations should be removed are all from three-dimensional figures mentioned in both scriptures and early rabbinic sources. And I refer to the cherubs in the temple, the brazen serpent from the wilderness, and a certain synagogue that existed in Nehardea, known as Beit Knishta de Shafvi Yativ. It's a synagogue known as Shafvi Yativ in Nehardea in Babylon that had a idol positioned at the entrance to it by the non-Jewish authorities in an attempt to belittle the Jews, maybe force them into conversion, part of a larger scheme, and eventually, nevertheless, the synagogue was still frequented, although this image was at the center or close by. In order to support my thesis, I now have to show you that three-dimensional motifs of lions and snakes, and a mixture of both, existed at the time period in the vicinity of Cologne. Now, lions and serpents, as well as a mixture of both decorative elements, appear on pillars of capitals and other stone reliefs from the second half of the 11th century, both in Germany, northern France, and England. I have quite a few examples for this, but for the sake of brevity, I will show you one from each region. The first, lions and serpents were carved into into a stone baptismal font found today in St. Wilfrid's Church in Brunswell, Yorkshire. The baptismal font itself is actually a base of a pillar. This is it, over here. it used to be a pillar. The pillar fell, and the font was carved into the pillar. So it was a base of a pillar carved in the 11th century, with its which is now currently in secondary use as a font, but the dating of the decorations themselves to the second half of the 11th century is certain and not contested. The serpents on the base of the pillar are winged like dragons, and I'll show you an image in a minute. Here you can see the winged serpents, and here are the lions with a very distinctive tail of a lion, a very distinctive feature of a lion in these kind of reliefs that we find from the late 11th and early 12th century. In another church in southern England, the Church of St. Paul and St. Peter in Peamarsh, Sussex, 11th century stone reliefs of lions are found on their doorposts on both sides of the lintel over the entrance. So you here have again with a very distinctive tail of the lion over here. Images of lions, serpents, and monsters, usually dragons, were common not only in England in the 11th and 12th centuries, but in Northern Europe as well. In France and Germany, these motifs are frequently used on pillar capitals and occasionally, as in England, in window and door lintels. Lions in particular appear on the base of gateposts, on capitals, and carved as stone reliefs into the base of churches, of church altars. Stone reliefs containing these motifs are found in churches in Saxony and Germany. A fine example was brought to my knowledge by Professor Asaf Pinkus of Tel Aviv University, and these are the lions from the Quedlinburg monastery or abbey, or convent actually. It was founded in 936, endowed by Holy Roman Imperial funds, and developed throughout the 11th century. Stone reliefs and other decorations of lions and serpents from the 11th century are still visible there today, and you can see here the mythical serpent Ouroboros, and here with a little enlargement. Okay. So I think I hope I managed to convince you that these elements are typical of the surrounding culture. We also have lion and serpent decorations from northern France, and this is of course a reconstruction of the Maison Sublime in Rouen. This is one capital used in this pillar over here. It's actually an inverted capital. It's a capital that turned into a base, one with a lion and one with the serpent on both sides. So we have this in Jewish architecture as well, and not too far away from Cologne. So again, not in Cologne itself, but in the vicinity. So in light of the frequent presence of lions and serpents in stone artwork of the period, we can assume that stone reliefs similar to those found in Rouen, Quedlinburg, and England were used in the walls close to the window in the synagogue in Cologne as well. Rabbi Eliakim was troubled by the fact that these animal images were raised in relief from the wall, and especially by the particular use of the serpent, to him reminiscent of a dragon. And here I refer to you all to the work of Ilya Rodov, our colleague Ilya Rodov, who discussed the issue of dragons in the first issue of Ars Judaica. So I also pay tribute to Ars Judaica in this context. In an attempt to drive the point home toward the end of the letter, Rabbi Eliakim cites as a model of emulation the righteous Judean biblical king Hezekiah, who crushed the brazen serpent fashioned by Moses, as he expects the people in Cologne to do with the images that they have carved into the stones of the windows, expecting them to discard the images that they have implemented into the walls, and he asked them to follow the example of King Hezekiah. It should be noted that in all probability, Rabbi Eliakim's letter of protest was ignored by the Cologne Jews. Nevertheless, a close reading of the text may provide us with the claims made by the individuals that were behind the commissioning of these stone relief ornamentations, since Rabbi Eliakim goes into pains in rejecting them one by one. And here you have the claims, and I'm not going to read them from the list because you have them in front of you, but I will make the following point. The commissioners of the decorations, or at least those who wished them to remain after they had already been placed, justified their presence by claiming that they were there simply to adorn the synagogue. Three-dimensional images of cherubs were already in the temple, and no one was concerned about whether they are idols to be worshipped and so on. And they did not represent other gods. that was in essence not a transgression of the second commandment. And since the synagogue is a little temple, Mikdash Me'at, therefore it derives its sanctity from the temple in Jerusalem, and what applies to the temple in Jerusalem can apply to any given synagogue of the time. One other aspect I would like to point out is that within Christian theological circles, we hear of a very vocal debate about three-dimensional art and representation that begun earlier, but was continued in this time period, especially in and around Cologne. It was in Cologne that the famous Gerokreuz could be seen at the local cathedral. It is the earliest three-dimensional sculpture of Jesus, dating from the 970s. In other words, about 100 years earlier to our debate, but the debate about three-dimensional art and three-dimensional representation is ongoing in Cologne, and it does not cease till the mid-12th century. In other words, this is something that is happening within the vicinity of the Cologne Jewish community and apparently influencing. There's no actual textual reference, but this is happening in and around the Jewish community of Cologne, who is extremely, extremely involved with what is going on. Just one pointer at this, which I'm going to quote off the top of my head, not from the writing, because I want to keep up with the time. The famous text by Hermann Quandam Judaios, Hermann the Jew, who used to be a Jew, or Hermann who used to be Judah, refers to the first time that he, as a Colonian Jew, encounters a three-dimensional sculpture of Jesus, and how he is appalled by it, and how these claims he makes about being appalled by it are refuted by Ruprecht of Deutz, who is right across the river in the monastery of Deutz from Cologne. So we're talking about something that is happening in and around Cologne at this time, late 11th, early 12th century. Now, we should ask ourselves, and this is the final point I'm going to be making, who commissioned these decorations? And this is where my talk becomes slightly more hypothetical, and I would appreciate if you comment on this, because I realize that I'm treading on speculative ground. I would like to suggest that although we have lions and serpents in the vicinity of Cologne, in and around Cologne, the reason someone was picking on these specific motifs is because of a specific person. Someone who I am reluctant to call a patron or a commissioner or someone who initiated, but someone whose personality apparently inspired these decorations. And we know very little about the people who are the lay leaders of Cologne, but we have one reference, and it's a fascinating reference. It's in the Chronicles referring to the 1096 riots of one of the people who was martyred in Cologne in 1096, and that is Yehuda ben Avraham, or Mar Yehuda bar Avraham, the Parnas. And you have here part of the description of Mar Yehuda, the Parnas from Cologne, that appears in the text of Shlomo bar Shimshon's chronicle of the 1096 riots. It's written in retrospect, and it's of course, I would say hagiographic in a sense, but still it is interesting to note that this person, this Parnas from Cologne, sees the Cologne synagogue as his home court. That's his home field. That's where he holds court. And all that this text discusses is exactly this feature, the fact that he presides over a large assembly in the Cologne synagogue. I would like to suggest that the fact that his name is Yehuda, and the fact that he is mentioned here as stemming from the tribe of Dan in the text, Hu haya mishevet hadani, may have influenced the choice of these two decorations, lions and serpents. I want to remind you that in Deuteronomy, Dan is also Dan Gur Aryeh Zanek Min Bashan, and he's also Nachash and Shfifon, and Yehuda is a Leo. So you've got all these motifs in the tribe of Dan, and the fact that he is mentioned as a member of the tribe of Dan, which is of course hypothetical, kind of drives this point home. So I will stop here. This is also the end of my presentation. I would very much like to hear your comments and thoughts on this. Thank you very much.